The forge never slept, even when the rest of Gavelmere tucked themselves into straw beds and wooden cots. The forge kept breathing. Slow, deep breaths of smoke and ash, exhaling sparks into the gloom like the sighs of a waking beast. He had been born into it, wrapped not in linen but in the lingering heat of a smoldering hearth. By the time Tomas turned 7, he had already earned the black under his fingernails and the tightness in his shoulders. Their forge stood on the edge of the village, where the trees began to thin and the dirt road forked toward the outer farms. The air inside was always thick, alive with floating motes of ash. Tomas had learned early to blink slow and breathe through his teeth. His father, Willem the smith, was a man built like a wall broad, scarred, and mostly silent. The village had already begun to wake. Outside hooves clattered on stone. A goat bleated somewhere. Chickens clucked. Tomas held the glowing metal steady with tongs, the heat biting close even through the thick leather gloves. His father raised the hammer. Clang. The sound filled the space like thunder. A line of armored knights on horseback riding through a muddy village road, their armor dusty and crests faded. A village girl named Elswith had once brought a cooking spit to be fixed. Her apron was stained with berry juice, and she smelled of sweet herbs. That night, while scrubbing soot from his hands with sand and cold water, he thought about how people only saw the man with the hammer. The first knight arrived by midday, dropped a sack of coins on the workbench without a word. Willem didn't speak. He just picked up the horseshoes and tossed them into the forge fire with a sharp hiss. For the first time, Tomas stepped into the heat, not just as an apprentice but as the smith. The forge roared louder. Tomas stared into the fire, the raw heat rippling against his face as the first horseshoe began to glow red. He gripped the long-handled tongs tighter, trying to steady his hand as the metal softened in the heart of the flames. This was no practice. Peace. This was no bent nail or broken latch for a chicken coop. A knight's horse would wear this. If it cracked, if it slipped, it could throw the rider and break his neck. Mistakes weren't allowed. Willem stood beside him, arms crossed, silent. Watching Tomas wanted to ask questions. How thick should the arc be? Should he widen the heels? How deep should the grooves run? But he said nothing. You don't ask questions in the forge. You act, or you burn. When the iron hit the anvil, it flared orange. Tomas swung the hammer. Once, twice. Rhythm mattered more than force. He kept the strikes even. The shoe began to take shape, slowly curving, the edges bending beneath the weight of every blow. His arms strained, his shoulders locked. But he didn't stop. The knight was outside, speaking to a few travelers near the well. Tomas could see his armor glint through the haze. He looked calm, composed, half bored by the simplicity of village life. He didn't seem to realize the sweat dripping from Tomas's chin, or the way his wrists throbbed from the shock of every hammer fall by the time the first shoe was shaped, quenched, and set aside. Tomas's arms felt like they were hanging from frayed ropes. His lungs ached from the smoke. His hair stuck to his forehead. And still, there were 3 more to go. He didn't complain. The second shoe went faster. He found the heat sooner, found the arc quicker. The fire hissed, the anvil sang, and the rhythm carried him forward like a song he'd heard since birth. Willem didn't speak, but Tomas caught the flicker of approval in his father's eyes. It was enough to keep him going. The last shoe had just cooled when the knight returned. He picked it up, inspected the edges with a practiced hand, then gave a tight nod. He said nothing else, just tossed another small coin onto the bench and walked away. Tomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That night, the forge still smoldered long after the rest of Gavelmere had gone dark. Tomas sat outside on a low stone, hands resting on his knees, knuckles bruised and burned. Willem sat nearby, sharpening a blade with slow, patient strokes. You hit the curve wrong on the second one, Willem said, not looking up, but it held. Tomas nodded. He wasn't sure if that was praise or correction. Maybe both. Willem paused. You didn't flinch. That's worth something. Then he went back to sharpening. Tomas smiled, just a little. His hands hurt, his eyes stung. And he could still hear the anvil ringing in his ears, but he smiled anyway. By the end of that week, word had spread. The nobleman's men spoke of the village forge that turned around work overnight. That the boy could hammer with speed and precision. But Willem's apprentice might be more than an assistant. Requests doubled, then tripled. A farmer came with a rusted plowshare that needed refurbishing. A cooper arrived with broken bands for his barrels. Even the priest came, complaining that the iron cross above the chapel had rusted loose in the wind. Tomas worked through it all. His fingers grew more calloused. His back bent lower over the anvil. Sleep came slower each night and left earlier each morning. He began to recognize the rhythm of pain, how it settled in his shoulders, how it moved in his knees, how it whispered in his joints like an old friend. One morning, he burned his palm on a half-cooled chisel. He didn't cry out, just wrapped a cloth around it and kept working. The skin blistered, peeled, then toughened. "You've got the hand for this," Willem muttered that evening as Tomas poured water from the well over the burn. Tomas didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he was proud or just tired. That night, as he lay on the straw mat in the loft above the forge, he thought about the road, about the knights passing through, the way their armor clanked like silver promises, the way their swords shimmered even in the shadow of the trees. They had direction, purpose. They rode for causes, for lords, for lands. Tomas swung a hammer in a box of stone and ash, day after day, until his bones groaned. And yet, when the iron glowed, when the sparks danced, when the shape took hold beneath his hands, it felt like something sacred, like breathing life into stone. Late summer came. The heat grew thicker. Flies buzzed around the corners of the forge, and every surface felt sticky with sweat and soot. A rider came through the village gates one evening, his horse lathered in sweat, his armor dented, his voice hoarse. A messenger from the north. Bandits had attacked a caravan near the old trade road. Guards were dead. Supplies taken. Survivors needed gear dash quick. Willem barely looked up from his anvil. "Tell your captain to send coin." The rider dropped a pouch of silver without argument. Tomas sharpened blades that night until the moon was high. Sword edges, axes, even a few crude spearheads. He worked by lantern light, his body aching, his face slick with sweat. When he dropped one of the swords and it clattered against the stone floor, he expected his father's glare. But Willem just nodded. "You're learning what it costs," he said. What costs? Work that matters." One morning, the forge bellows broke. The old leather split down the side with a sound like a goat being kicked. The fire died, slow and coughing. Tomas cursed under his breath. Willem didn't speak for a long time. Then he simply said, "Fetch the hide." They worked together in silence, sewing the leather with thick cord, reinforcing the frame with iron bands. It took hours, fingers bloodied from slipping through dried seams. But when Tomas tested the repaired bellows, and the fire roared back to life, a rare grin crept across Willem's face. "You keep this place breathing," he said. It was the first time he'd ever said you, not we. A week later, while hammering out a set of hinges for a merchant's wagon, Tomas's hand slipped. The hammer clipped his left thumb hard enough to break the nail. Blood spurted. He hissed, but didn't drop the tool. Just finished the stroke, set the hammer down, and grabbed a rag. Willem handed him a basin of water. "Soak it. You'll be swinging again by nightfall. I can use my right for now," Tomas replied. Willem raised an eyebrow. "Good." That night, Willem brought out a wrapped bundle from beneath his workbench. Tomas unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a hammer new, polished, weighted perfectly to his grip. The handle was wrapped in dark leather, the head inscribed with a tiny mark, a crescent moon, Willem's signature. "It's yours," his father said. "You've earned it." Tomas ran his fingers along the leather, unsure what to say. "You named mine once," Willem said. "Old Thunder? What'll you call yours?" Tomas looked at the burn scars across his knuckles, the black beneath his nails, the faint outline of a handprint forever etched into the apron where hot coal had landed. "Ironwake," he said. Quietly, Willem grunted approval. As autumn crept in, the work changed. Horseshoes again. harrows for turning soil, hooks for hanging meat. The orders slowed as the harvest began. People stayed home more, coin tightened. The air cooled one morning as frost kissed the forge stones. A rider arrived. No banner, no armor, just a leather satchel and a face drawn with worry. "I need a weapon," the man said. "Something quick." Willem eyed him carefully. "Why?" The man hesitated. "My wife was taken, North Woods, 3 days ago. I've no guards, just me." Thomas stepped forward before he realized he was doing it. "I'll make it." Willem turned slowly, said nothing. Just nodded once. Thomas forged through the night. He chose a short blade, thick along the spine, balanced for close fighting, not elegant, but reliable. He heated, hammered, quenched, and sharpened, watching the steel take form like a rising storm. The man left at dawn with the blade tied to his belt, and a nod of quiet thanks. Thomas stood in the forge entrance, watching the frost melt on the grass. "You didn't charge him," Willem said from behind. "No. You don't always have to." That winter was hard. Wood was scarce. The forge fire had to be watched constantly to keep from dying. Thomas learned to sleep in shifts, stoking embers through the night with hands wrapped in burlap. Customers came, in less often, but the ones who did came with broken things, tools, worn from too many seasons, metal rusted by time and cold. Thomas saw desperation in their eyes. Some brought nothing but bread or scraps of cheese. One woman traded a silver thimble for a kitchen. Hook dot. They accepted it all. The forge didn't burn for wealth. It burned because someone had to keep it alive, and Thomas had become its keeper. Winter clung to the village like a second skin. Wind screamed through the trees beyond the forge, and each gust made the wooden beams creak like groaning giants. The forge's fire, once a roaring presence, now crackled more softly, not for lack of will, but for want of fuel. Thomas rubbed his hands together near the embers, teeth clenched against the morning chill. His breath rose in clouds as he knelt to check the coals. Only a few black lumps remained, too little to heat anything larger than a spoon. Willem entered, draped in a heavy wool cloak, his beard stiff with frost. "We'll need more coal," he said. Thomas nodded. "There's some left in the old quarry," he offered. "It's frozen through. We'll have to dig for it." By we, he meant Thomas. The quarry sat at the far edge of Gavelmere, just past the crooked hill where the crows nested in bare trees. It hadn't been mined properly in years, but a few villagers still scavenged small pieces from the frozen dust. Thomas loaded a barrow with a shovel and set off before the sun had fully risen. His boots crunched over the ice. Each breath stabbed, like a blade in his chest. By the time he reached the quarry, his fingers were already stiff, despite the wool gloves. The ground was hard, brittle, like hammering stone with your bare hands. But he dug anyway. Hours passed. His back ached. The shovel slipped more than it struck. But slowly, steadily, he found lumps of coal beneath the frost. He stacked them in the barrow like gold coins, each one a promise of fire. When he returned, Willem had already set iron in the forge. Waiting, Thomas dumped the coal and fed it in, piece by piece, until the flames returned to life. Not as strong as summer's blaze, but enough. Enough to begin by midwinter. Thomas could barely remember what rest felt like. The forge demanded attention at all hours. The bellows wheezed, the fire sputtered, and tools cracked in the cold, if not handled right. Even water buckets froze solid, needing to be thawed near the coals just to be usable. Despite it all, people still came. A farmer brought in a snapped scythe blade. A baker needed a new rack after his old one warped in the oven heat. An old woman with hands like twisted twigs came seeking a poker for her. Her last one had splintered after years of use. Thomas repaired it all. His hands never stopped. When one job ended, another stood waiting. Some nights, when the fire had died low and Willem had gone to sleep, Thomas would sit alone in the forge. He'd hold a cold tool in his lap and listen to the wind rattle the shutters. He didn't speak, didn't think. He just sat, letting the silence settle into his bones. The forge was his burden, but it was also his companion, his rhythm, his anchor. Then one day, Willem didn't rise. Tomas found him still in bed, wrapped in furs, eyes open but not moving. "I can't feel my legs," the old man said, voice hoarse. Tomas tried to hide his panic. He helped Willem sit up, fetched water, built the fire higher, but his father didn't move from the cot all day. His breath came slower, his face pale. "The cold's got me," he muttered. "Too many winters, too much smoke." Tomas stayed by his side for hours, but the forge called. Smoke had stopped. Rising from its mouth, he knew people would come. "I'll be back," he whispered. Willem grunted. "The fire doesn't wait." That week, Tomas worked alone. He stoked the fire, sharpened the tools, finished the orders. People noticed. Some asked after the old smith, but most just handed him their iron and moved on. Willem stayed in bed, sometimes calling out for water, sometimes mumbling to himself. Tomas kept feeding him soup, tending the fire in his father's room, listening for the rasp of his breathing between hammer strikes. The forge didn't slow up one night. After repairing a cracked cauldron, Tomas sat in the workshop, hands shaking. He held his hammer beyond wakehand, looked around the space, his father's workbench, the old anvil, the racks of tools. All of it waited for him now. All of it whispered, "Yours." 3 days later, Tomas stood beside his father's cot, holding a steaming cup of broth. Willem didn't take it. His chest had stopped moving. Tomas stared at the stillness for a long time. He didn't cry. He just sat, holding the cup until the steam faded into the cold. The villagers came the next morning. Some left bread, others left coins. A few muttered prayers. No one asked who would run the forge now. They already knew. Tomas buried his father behind the forge, beneath the only tree that grew on the hill. He dug the hole with his own hands. No shovel, no help. Just earth, cold and unyielding. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. That evening, he lit the forge again. He fed the fire, checked the tools, cleaned the soot from the floor. Then he took his father's hammer, the one marked with the crescent moon, and placed it on the wall above the anvil. He did not try to use it. He had his own. The forge belonged to Tomas now, not because anyone said so, but because there was no one else. The villagers brought their broken tools and dull blades to him, as if nothing had changed. They didn't speak of Willem. They didn't need to. The anvil still rang, the fire still burned, and Tomas still worked. At first, it was easier to keep moving. Grief had no time to settle if his hands were busy. But at night, when the fire dimmed and the bellows wheezed to sleep, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was haunted. He caught himself listening for Willem's heavy footsteps, for the clearing of his throat, for the scold that never came. But all he heard was the pop of embers and the faint creak of the roof beams. Shifting in the cold, Willem had never said goodbye. Tomas didn't know if he was supposed to. In Gavelmere, men didn't speak of death unless someone needed burying. The snow melted early that year. Spring pushed through the frost like a blacksmith bending steels low, firm, and inevitable. The first time Tomas forged a sword alone, he felt like an intruder in his own forge. It was a request from a man traveling south to join a distant lord's army. The man offered 2 silver coins and a promise to spread the smith's name along the way. Tomas accepted. He worked through the night. The iron took shape slowly, unwilling at first, then gradually yielding under the heat and the hammer. He remembered Willem's words, "Strike with rhythm, not rage." The blade took form, straight, sharp, plain, a soldier's weapon, no flourishes, no fancy hilt. But it would cut true. The man took it in silence, tested the weight, nodded once, and left. Tomas watched him disappear down the road and felt nothing, not pride, not relief, just ... Smoke, more work came. A wheel rim for the tanner, a cooking spit for the innkeeper, dozens of nails for the carpenter rebuilding the mill bridge. With each task, Tomas's movements became sharper, more efficient. He barely had to think. His hands remembered what his mind didn't need to, but he began to realize something. No one spoke to him the way they had spoken to Willem. They didn't joke. They didn't linger. They called him boy, even now. He was no longer an apprentice, but they hadn't yet decided if he was a master. One morning, a stranger arrived. She wore a long coat patched at the elbows, and a hood shadowed her face. Her boots were stained with old mud, and a leather satchel clinked as she walked. She placed a wrapped bundle on the workbench and opened it slowly. Inside was a sword, or what was left of one. The blade was cracked, the edge chipped, the hilt scorched. A war relic, battered beyond use. "Can you mend it?" she asked. Tomas studied the sword. "No, but I can reforge it." She nodded. "Then do that." She didn't. "Ask the price." She didn't offer a name. She just stepped back and folded her arms. Tomas began. The metal fought him. It was stubborn, warped by fire and time. But he worked patiently. He reheated it, rehammered the spine, filed the edge clean, recast the guard with fresh iron. His arms ached, but he didn't stop. The woman watched, silent. When the blade was done, he set it on the bench. "It won't be the same," he said. "I didn't want the same," she replied. She picked it up, tested the balance, and then for the first time smiled. "You're better than he was," she said. "Who? The smith before?" Tomas hesitated. "That was my father." The woman's smile faded, not with shame, but respect. "He taught you well." She left 3 coins, more than the sword was worth, and then she disappeared into the forest road, without a word more, that night. Tomas didn't sleep. He stood in the forge, staring at the place his father's hammer hung on the wall. The moonlight filtered through the roof hole, casting pale shadows. On the soot-stained floor, he stepped forward, and took the hammer down. It felt heavier than he remembered. He turned it over in his hands. The crescent moon engraving was worn. The handle still bore the marks of Willem's fingers. Tomas gripped it tightly, and for the first time since the burial, he whispered, "Thank you." He placed it back on the wall. Then he lit the fire again. Spring returned to Gavelmere, not with a flourish, but like a cautious traveler. The snow melted into muddy streams. Chickens wandered freely again. Children began to shout in the fields like birds reawakened. For everyone else, life resumed its quiet rhythm. For Tomas, nothing changed. The forge still demanded fire. The tools still demanded care. The work never paused, but something inside him had shifted. He was no longer just doing the work. He was becoming it. Every hammer strike felt heavier, more precise. Every blade he finished carried a little more of his handprint, though he never carved his name into the steel. Blacksmiths didn't sign things. They left proof in weight and wear, in balance and bite. People stopped calling him boy, not because he asked them to, but because they could see it. He was no longer a boy. He was the forge. One morning, a group of soldiers passed through town. They weren't knights, just lean, weathered men in patched mail and old tunics bearing the faded emblem of a distant baron. They stopped outside the forge, leading tired horses and rusted weapons. One of them, a younger man with red blonde stubble and a missing finger, leaned against the doorframe and asked, "You open?" Tomas didn't answer. He was already bringing water to a boil by midday. He had 4 swords on the bench, 2 buckles to reforge, and a spearhead to replace. He worked until dusk. The soldiers waited, sharing dried meat and grimy stories. Tomas said nothing. He didn't ask where they were going, or why their blades were chipped with fresh notches. He didn't care. The work was enough. When the youngest soldier picked up the finished sword and swung it a few times in the yard, he let out a low whistle. "Clean edge," he muttered. "Didn't think we'd find a real smith in this bog scrape of a town." The others nodded, dropping coins and compliments in equal measure. Tomas barely acknowledged either that night. He slept with soot still on his hands by early summer. People began asking for Tomas by name. A merchant from 2 towns over brought a load of broken iron tools and left with a cart full of repairs, telling anyone who would listen, "That boy down in Gavelmere, he works faster than the priests lie." On tax day, another brought an old helmet cracked at the rim. Tomas reforged it and returned it with an added layer of rivets that made it safer than when it was first forged. "Can't even see the seam," the man said, tapping the helm like it was made of glass. "You sure you're not magic?" Tomas gave no reply. He didn't smile, didn't bow, just nodded and returned to his anvil. The forge didn't run on praise. It ran on heat and time and the silence. Between clangs on the hottest day of the year, a nobleman came riding through. Not a high-born lord with a feathered hat and lace cuffs. This man wore a faded cloak and a wolfskin cape. His armor was dark, dull, and plainly functional. He dismounted in front of the forge, followed by 2 quiet guards. Tomas looked up from a pitchfork he'd been sharpening. "I need something reforged," the nobleman said, pulling a wrapped bundle from his horse's side. "Something old." He unwrapped it with slow care. Inside lay the remains of a sword. Its blade was broken in 2 places, and the guard was half melted from some past fire. Tomas didn't ask questions. He simply examined it, turning it over in his hands. "This metal's seen war," he muttered. The nobleman smiled faintly. "Hasn't everything worth keeping?" Tomas nodded. 2 days. 3, and I'll double your price." Tomas shrugged. "Suit yourself." The nobleman stayed in town, lodging at the alehouse. His guards watched Tomas work from the edge of the forge, but they never interfered. It took longer than he'd expected. The metal had old fatigue, like bones too long broken. Tomas had to reforge the temps, hammer out the old cracks, grind the edge down to new steel. He rebalanced the weight, fitted a fresh grip, bound in leather dot. When he finished, the sword wasn't beautiful, but it was powerful and quiet. The kind of weapon that didn't sing, it whispered. The nobleman returned just after dawn. On the 3rd day, he held the sword in both hands, testing the feel of it. Then he sheathed it and dropped a pouch heavy with coin on the bench. "You know," he said, "there are lords who'd pay to have a smith like you on retainer. You could have land servants, a place at court." Tomas didn't look up. "I have a place." The nobleman studied him a moment longer, then smiled again. I suppose you do." He rode off without another word. Tomas pocketed the coin and went back to work. Later that summer, a fire broke out in the baker's shop. The forge bell rang wildly, and Tomas heard shouting from across the green. Smoke spiraled up into the sky like a ghost trying to flee, without thinking. Tomas dropped his tools and ran. The roof had already caved by the time he arrived. Villagers scrambled to form a line from the well, but the flames were too high, the walls too dry. Inside, the baker's wife screamed as her husband tried to carry out a chest of flour and coin. Tomas didn't hesitate. He wrapped a wet cloak around his shoulders and ran straight through the burning doorway. The heat hit him like a hammer. Sparks flew into his face, but he reached the chest, lifted it with his back, and hauled it out into the open just before the rear wall gave way. The crowd dragged the baker and his wife clear. Someone smacked Tomas's shoulders to put out embers on his tunic. His eyebrows were gone, his arms blistered, his throat raw, but he didn't cry out. He stood panting, eyes stinging, soot black on his face. "You're mad." The baker, Whee. Zed Tomas didn't answer. He just nodded once and walked back to the forge. That night, the forge fire danced higher than usual. He sat near it, shirtless, a salve wrapped around his arms. He watched the flame twist and roar, casting shadows across the walls like flickering memories. Willem's hammer still hung above the anvil. Ironwake lay beside it. Tomas didn't move for a long time. At some point, a child came to the door. One of the local lads, Henrik perhaps. He hesitated, then stepped closer, holding out. Something. Tomas blinked. It was a crude little Nifany Venduld, probably carved from scrap. "My brother said it's not sharp," the boy mumbled, "but I want to fix it." Tomas took it without a word. He studied it, ran his fingers across the edge. It was. "Your first try?" he asked. The boy nodded. Tomas motioned for him to come closer. He placed a hand on the lad's shoulder and said, "Then it's better than perfect. It's real." The boy beamed. By the next week, 3 more children had shown up. One wanted to learn how to hold tongs. Another asked if she could pump the bellows. A third just liked watching the fire. Tomas didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He let them watch, let them fetch water, let them sweep the floor. He didn't teach them, but he let the forge speak for itself. One morning, a letter arrived from the nearby town of Barrowfen. It was sealed in wax, marked with the crest of the town council. Tomas opened it slowly. To the smith of Gavelmere, it read, "Your reputation has reached us by way of merchants and knights alike. Barrowfen has long lacked a master of your skill. We offer a residence, forge, and formal title master of iron should you choose to relocate." There was more. Promises. Of gold. Of recognition. Of honor. Tomas set the letter on the bench and stared at it. For a long time, then he folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer where Willem used to keep old ledgers. He never replied. Autumn came. The trees turned gold and red. The villagers prepared for harvest. The forge grew cooler in the evenings. Tomas found he could sleep again, sometimes even without waking in pain. One evening he sat at the forge entrance, feet in the dirt, watching the last of the sun dip beneath. The trees. Henrik came running, a battered horseshoe in his hands. "It's from old Miller's cart," the boy said. It cracked. Tomas took it, ran a thumb along the edge. "Then let's make it right." The fire roared back to life. The first frost of autumn crept in before the village was ready. It painted the windows with white breath, hardened the ground beneath the last of the falling apples, and reminded everyone that winter waited, quiet and sharp, just beyond the next. Morning, inside the forge, Tomas kept the fire higher than usual, not because he needed to, but because the cold made the silence louder. The jobs were fewer now. Most villagers were preparing for the end of harvest, patching roofs, storing grain, trimming the fat from livestock. Tools were sharpened once, then set aside. Repairs could wait. So Tomas cleaned. He scrubbed soot from the corners of the walls, sorted rivets, filed down old hammerheads. He counted horseshoes twice over and melted down warped nails for reuse. He spoke little, but in his mind there was a constant rhythm. Breathe, heat, strike. Cool. On the third morning of frost, a girl appeared in the doorway. She couldn't have been more than 15. Her coat was too thin for the season, patched. In odd places, her boots didn't match, but her eyes were sharp. "I heard you teach," she said. Tomas looked up from his anvil. He didn't remember saying that to anyone, but perhaps silence said enough. "I don't," he replied. Then, softer, "Not really." She shrugged. "Still want to learn." He studied her face. Her jaw was stubborn, not angry, just settled, like a decision had already been made, and the world would need to catch up. "Name Rilla, family, none that matter." Tomas nodded slowly, then pointed to the broom in the corner. "Start there." Rilla returned every morning. At first she swept, then she watched. Soon, she was fetching coal, sorting iron scrap, pumping the bellows without being asked. She never complained, never asked questions, just listened. Tomas didn't give lessons. He let her shadow him. When he twisted iron, she twisted alongside him. When he quenched a blade, she peered over the tank to see the smoke hiss. One afternoon, he handed her a chunk of soft iron and gestured to the smaller hammer. "Make something," she frowned. "What?" "Doesn't matter." It took her the better part of 2 hours. The iron heated unevenly. Her grip slipped. The hammer bounced more than it struck. But when she was done, she handed him a crude, uneven spiral hook. It wouldn't have held much weight, but it had shape, purpose. Tomas turned it over in his palm. "It's ugly." Rilla said. "It's yours," he answered. She didn't smile, but she stayed longer that day. As the leaves gave up the last of their colors, the jobs began to return. A snapped hoe blade, a dented helm, a carpenter's chisel broken along the grain. Farmers preparing for a hard winter meant tools needed mending and trust. Once slowly earned, was now freely given. People left coins now, not just promises. One evening, A traveling tinker stopped by, with a bent wheel rim and a mouthful of stories. "You know," he said, as Tomas inspected the damage, "I've passed a dozen villages this month. Most of them have broken carts and no one to fix them. One woman tried to repair her axle with breadsticks." Tomas chuckled. "Ever think of traveling?" the tinker asked. Rilla glanced up from the hearth. "No," Tomas said, his voice low. The tinker shrugged. "Fair enough. Still folk talk about you like you're a ghost. Say you never leave the forge." Tomas didn't answer. Ghost or not, he had a fire to feed. That night, Rilla stayed late. She cleaned the forge without being told, then sat beside the anvil as Tomas worked. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He paused. "Used to, and now I have a fire. It needs tending." She tilted her head. "That's not really an answer." Tomas leaned back, wiping soot from his arms. "This place is more than walls. The forge it's not. Just fire and metal. It's memory. If I leave, it dies." Rilla was quiet for a moment. "Maybe, or maybe it goes with you." He didn't reply, but later, after she'd gone, he found himself staring at the door longer than usual. By midwinter, the forge felt more like a refuge than a workshop. Snow fell in slow sheets, blanketing the village in silence, so thick even. The hounds gave up barking. The river froze at the edges, and the trees stood naked and brittle as bones. Tomas kept the forge blazing, day and night, not just for work, but because the fire kept more than the cold away. Rilla came daily, wrapped in a thick wool cloak someone in the village must have given her. She no longer waited for permission. She worked. She spoke less now, struck cleaner, asked sharper questions. Tomas never praised her, but he no longer corrected her. Either one morning, Tomas woke, with his hands aching more than usual. Not the usual throb from hammering or burns. This was something deeper, something cold inside the bone, like fire, couldn't reach it anymore. He ignored it at first, soaked his hands in hot water, clenched the tongs tighter, but it didn't fade. His knuckles swelled, his fingers curled. Slower, he dropped a hammer for the first time in 10 years. Rilla rushed to pick it up. She held it out to him, eyes searching. "You." "All right." He took it back, just tired. But his grip was weaker, and Rilla noticed that weak. She began taking over more tasks without asking. She pumped the bellows longer, filed the edges straighter, moved tools to where Tomas wouldn't have to stretch. She did it quietly, without pity. She didn't say the word, but he knew what she was thinking. Old. It came to a head the day a woodsman arrived, dragging a shattered axe and a new order for 2 more. Deep frosts, splitting trees like thunderclaps. He grunted, shaking snow from his cloak. "Need something better than this bent scrap." Tomas nodded and reached for the iron bar stock, but his arm didn't move right. The pain in his wrist shot up to his elbow, and he winced despite himself. The woodsman noticed. "You all right there, Smith?" "I'll get it," Tomas muttered. But Rilla was already beside him, picking up the iron. "I'll start," she said. "You guide." Tomas hesitated, then nodded. He lit the fire. But she struck the steel. It was the first time he didn't touch the hammer for an entire job. Rilla forged both axes. Under Tomas's eye, he watched her stance, corrected her strikes, made her redo the edge on one of them. But her hands didn't shake. Her heat was clean, her tempering patient. The woodsman tested the balance, grunted his approval, and paid in silver. "You've trained her well," he said. Tomas didn't answer, not because he disagreed, but because something in his chest felt like a coal gone cold. That night, he sat by the forge alone, shoulders wrapped in a wool blanket, hands in his lap. He stared at his fingers, stiff, swollen, burned, bent. These were the hands that once lifted anvils, that caught falling tongs, that split iron with a single swing. Now, they barely closed into a fist. He didn't hear Rilla come in. "You're still strong," she said. He flinched slightly. "Not in the way I need to be. You're wrong." She stepped into the firelight. her face ruddy from cold. "You've shaped steel that won't forget your touch. You taught me, even when you didn't mean to." Tomas stared at the coals. "I'm no master. You don't have to be," she said. "You built something, not just blades, a place, a path." There was silence for a while, save for the quiet hiss of cooling iron. Then Tomas asked, "What would you do if the fire ever stopped?" Rilla thought a moment. "I'd carry the coals," she said, "and start again." The new year broke through the frost like a blade through buck, sharp, sudden, and without apology. The snow receded into hard earth. Icicles wept themselves into puddles. But Tomas's hands did not heal with the thaw. Each joint still ached. With cold memory, his fingers curled slower by the day. Some mornings, they didn't straighten at all. He began sleeping longer, working shorter hours, letting Rilla take the first swing, the final quench, the reshaping of every warped hinge and weary nail. And though the fire still roared, it was Rilla now who fed it. One morning, Tomas stood outside the forge alone. The sun was just rising over the trees, the frost still hugging the edges of the grass. He stared at the building, at the smoke drifting from the roof hole, at the scorched walls, the anvil's silhouette in the doorway. The forge had always looked large to him. Now it looked old, not just in its beams or its roofline, but in the way it leaned slightly like it, too, was weary of standing. Rilla appeared, beside him, pulling her cloak tighter. "You? All right." Tomas didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I think I've gone as far as this place will let me." Rilla tilted her head. "You're leaving?" "No." He looked at his hands. "I'm stopping." That afternoon, he told her everything. How Willem had worked until his fingers bled, and how Tomas swore he wouldn't do the same. How he thought, maybe, just maybe, he'd escape the pain, beat the forge with stubborn youth and willpower. But the forge always wins in the end. It takes, he said, and takes, and takes. You don't realize it until there's nothing left to give. Rilla nodded. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just listened. "You're stronger than I was. At your age," he continued, "and smarter. You'll do more with this place than I ever did." Then he reached beneath the anvil and retrieved a small wooden box, blackened at the corners with soot dot inside. 3 small items. A broken horseshoe, from the first he ever forged. On his own, a bent nail, still crooked from his apprentice days, and the twisted iron spiral Rilla had made the first week she joined him. He held them out to her. "You'll know when to pass them on." From that day, Tomas no longer lifted a hammer, but he came to the forge every morning. He sat on the stool by the door, wrapped in wool, sipping weak cider, watching. He corrected less, smiled more. Sometimes, he even laughed. Word of the girlsmith. If Gavelmere began to spread by the time spring returned. Travelers brought tools from miles away. Merchants left with blades sharp enough to shave oak. And for the first time since his father died, Tomas felt peace, not the absence of pain, but the fullness of letting go. People still called it his forge. He started calling it hers. One evening, as the sun burned low, Rilla found Tomas asleep. By the hearth, she covered him with his old apron and sat nearby, listening to the slow crackle of the last coals. He stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Rilla," he said softly. "Yes. When I'm gone," he murmured. "Don't mourn the silence. Just feed the fire." And then he slept again, deeper than before. The first storm of spring rolled in with a sky the color of charcoal, and a wind that rattled every window in Gavelmere. The forge, as always, remained standing. Rilla stood alone before the anvil, sleeves rolled, apron tight, hair tied back with a strip of leather so stained it might have belonged to Tomas himself. The fire behind her was steady, not raging, not dim. It breathed. She had lit it before dawn, just as he had taught her. And now she waited. Tomas hadn't risen that morning. He still breathed, still muttered in his sleep. But his hands, no longer, twitched with the phantom weight of a hammer. They rested, unmoving, like a smith with no more metal to shape. Rilla hadn't cried. Not yet. Instead, she opened the forge. Because that's what he would have done. Because that's what she'd do. Every day forward. By mid-morning, work arrived. A traveling mason with a cracked chisel. A farmer whose cartwheel had split. A young boy with a sheep bell so rusted it barely jingled. Each job was met with a nod. A short word, a silent gesture toward the growing wall of tools she'd reshaped with her own hands. They didn't ask about Tomas, but their eyes wandered to the empty stool by the forge door. Rilla didn't explain. She just worked. The rhythm returned quickly. Strike, turn, quench, cool, repeat. She wasn't Tomas. Her swing was different. Her edge sharper. She used less force, more control. Her arms hadn't yet curled under the weight of years, but her back knew the ache. Her hands bore their own tapestry of scars. She moved with purpose, with memory. Each motion whispered with his presence, but echoed with her own. A new kind of silence settled over the forge knot emptiness. But space she would fill. That night, she closed the forge alone. Tomas still slept, though his breaths came slower. She placed a hand over his and left it there for a while, feeling the still warmth. Then, without a word, she climbed the ladder to the loft and lay awake under the heavy blankets. He'd once mended with wire. She didn't cry, but her hands curled, tight around the twisted iron spiral she'd once forged. The one he had returned to her. The first thing she ever made. The beginning. When the sun rose the next day, Tomas didn't wake. The villagers gathered quietly. No bell was rung, no grand speech was given. Blacksmiths did not get songs, only memory, only smoke, only what they left behind. Rilla placed his apron over the stool, hung his hammer above the forge, and stoked the fire again. Days passed, then weeks. Word spread not just of Tomas's passing, but of what remained, of the girl with the steady hand, of the fire that never went out. Of Gavelmere's forge, now the heartbeat of a new chapter. Old farmers came with broken sides. Young squires brought blades to dull for drills. Even a noble steward appeared one day, offering coin for a gate. Latch as strong as the last one, if she can match it. Rilla did more than match it. She improved it one night. As rain pattered gently against the roof, she pulled out the old wooden box again. Inside lay the same three objects: the broken horseshoe, the crooked nail, and the twisted hook dot she held, each for a long moment, then added something new. A tiny, perfect hinge no longer than her thumb, but shaped with such care it looked like jewelry. The first she had made after Tomas died. The first truly her own. She closed the box, tucked it beneath the anvil dot, and fed the fire. The forge breathed, not in the way living things do, but in the way old places do, those that have seen generations pass through them, carrying soot on their skin and fire in their lungs. It sighed with every gust of wind through the roof hole. It muttered with each glowing ember tucked deep in its belly, and it remembered Willem. It remembered Tomas, and now it remembered Rilla. She kept the fire low on some mornings, letting the coals speak for themselves while she sharpened blades or mended hinges. On others, she stoked it so high the whole street smelled of ash and iron. She worked with rhythm, but not rush. Every tool had its place. Every customer knew her name. She no longer felt like an apprentice wearing a borrowed apron. She was the blacksmith dot. Not the girlsmith, not the helper, not the flame dash keeper. The forge was hers. When children walked past, they'd pause to peek inside. Some were bold enough to enter. Rilla didn't chase them off. She taught them to sweep without burning their toes. She let them feel the hammer lightly under her guidance. She showed them the spiral hook in the box and said, "This was my first." One child, no older than 8, asked, "Did it hurt to learn?" Rilla smiled. Yes, then, but it was worth it. Spring gave way to a warm summer, the kind that made the anvil too hot to touch by midday. Work slowed again. Rilla didn't mind. She took those days to craft small things: hooks, locks, even toys. Not because she was asked, but because creation no longer needed permission. She carved a tiny horse from scrap iron, left it on the window for a traveling boy who loved real ones. She built a stronger latch for the apothecary shutter, free of charge. People started bringing her things before they broke, because they trusted her. One morning, she awoke to the smell of ash and honey. A fire in the distance, someone burning the stubble fields. But the honey, it came from the paper folded on her doorstep. A letter, sealed with wax. From a merchant's guild to towns east. They'd heard of her work. They were offering commission, payment, travel, even. Work on cathedral hinges, castle gates, royal fittings. Big work, important work. Work that meant leaving Gavelmere. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the anvil, at Tomas's hammer, still hanging above it. At the 3 iron relics inside the old wooden box. At the forge, breathing gently behind her. Could she leave it? Would it even let her go? That evening, she lit no fire. She sat instead at the edge of the forge, lantern burning low beside her, staring into the dark hearth. She didn't speak aloud, but in her mind, she asked Tomas, "What now?" No voice answered, only a breeze, but she understood. The next day, she accepted the offer, but not the travel. She would craft the pieces here, in Gavelmere. Let the carts come to her. Let the merchants find their way, because the forge was not just where she worked, it was who she was. In the years that followed, Rilla's name reached far beyond the village. Pilgrims whispered about the smith with fire in her bones. Lords sent their squires to study her technique. Tinkerers brought flawed tools just to see how she'd improve them. But to the people of Gavelmere, she remained just Rilla, the girl who grew up. Inside the flame, the woman who shaped the world with her hands, the keeper of the forge. When the time came, as it does for all who wield iron and fire, she selected no apprentice. Not yet. Instead, she left the doors open, and one spring, a quiet, nervous boy stepped inside. He held a broken bell and a knotted string. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave. Rilla handed him the broom, and so it began again. Because the forge never truly ends. It only passes hands, from those blistered by work to those brave enough to burn, and the fire goes on.